Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, April 18th, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 7 and our 35th webinar in the series of webinars on the topic, comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I'm turning the webinar over to him now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks also to all of our participants who will be discussing these matters today. As you stated, we are discussing aspects of my discussion document, Revelation Revealed, which I wrote in the middle of 2016. In practice today, we will be focusing on a supplement that I wrote in the middle of 2019 called Living the Real Religion of Jesus, which in effect is an insert into topic 8. For those of you viewers who may not have been following our series, I would suggest to you that you would benefit greatly by downloading these documents. And I will now give you the website. The website is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. This is the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The links that will allow you to download Revelation Revealed and Living the Real Religion of Jesus are about 2/3 of the way down the homepage that I have just given you. In practice, we will be focusing today exclusively on the supplement, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. So if you want to economize on your effort, it would be sufficient to download that document. We are not going to turn to the main document, Revelation Revealed, during our discussion today. Now, because you are not able to ask us any questions as we are going along, we offer you the option of sending in a question or two by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address listed at the bottom of that same homepage. The email address is as follows: info@globalendeavor.net. I say again, info@globalendeavor.net. In all these cases, the words Global Endeavor are treated as if they were a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. Now, if you send us in a question and we decide to use it during a future webinar, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And in that event, I would put the question of yours to the entire panel who are participating on that day. So you would get an answer from everyone collectively, not simply an answer from me on a personal level. So now we will start the substantive discussion that will occupy us today. Specifically, we are on page 12 of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. We are examining paragraphs from the instructions that Emmanuel, the Union of Days, gave to Michael of Salvington shortly before Michael left Salvington in order to come to Urantia to serve as the bestowal son in the human identity of Jesus of Nazareth. Last week, we concluded discussion of the paragraph at the bottom of page 11. And so now we are starting to discuss, or I should say, we are resuming discussion of the two paragraphs at the top of page 12 of the document, paragraphs which bear the numbers 4 and 5. Now, to the best of my recollection, George kindly read these paragraphs for me last week, and so I will call on a different colleague. Andre, do you have them available? Would you be willing to read these two paragraphs for us, please?
I certainly would.
Thank you.
So number 4, under no circumstances, and not even in the least detail, should you interfere with the normal and orderly progressive evolution of the Urantia races. But this prohibition must not be interpreted as limiting your efforts to leave behind you on Urantia and enduring an improved system of positive religious ethics. As a dispensational son, you are granted certain privileges pertaining to the advancement of the spiritual and religious status of the world peoples. 5. As you may see fit, you are to identify yourself with existing religious and spiritual movements as they may be found on your rancha, but in every possible manner seek to avoid the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, or a segregated ethical grouping of mortal beings. Your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples. Mantusha Melchizedek from 120, section 3, paragraphs 4 through 6.
Thank you. Now, we did begin discussing paragraph numbered 4, the first of the two paragraphs that Andre read just now. And in the course of that preliminary discussion, Bob stated that he had been looking at the phrase in the middle of the paragraph, improved system of positive religious ethics. Further, he stated that he was examining or had examined the word system and the word religious as opposed to ethics of some other kind. So I would like to turn to Bob now, if I could, to ask him about the word system. A system normally implies a variety of elements that are put in some kind of an order. So is that your understanding of system as it is used in this phrase, Bob, or would you give us some other explanation?
That's a great question, Neil. The system theory is a relatively recent theory in the 20th century. And there are lots of definitions of what a system is. You described it as a self-contained set of, well, I'm paraphrasing here, but a self-contained set of processes that has an input and an output, may have multiple inputs and outputs. You know, we can think of lots of systems. You know, the human body is a really good example of multiple systems of systems. You know, the lungs, for example, is a system that brings in oxygen and nitrogen and transforms it into carbon dioxide, and then moves the oxygen into the blood system. Systems theory actually involves quite a bit of detail. I think the best background of this, and we talked about, I think I talked about this a few webinars ago, is this idea of cybernetics, which is basically the theory of the interaction between man and machine, and how to make machines with positive and negative feedback. That's where the idea of negative feedback comes. It's a system that can build itself into a self-sustaining homogeneous flow. Your house air conditioning system or heating system is a system that is basically driven by those sorts of things. It's just a feedback system. You know, you set a goal and it you know, goes. So I think that this idea of an ethical system, there's lots of different kinds of ethical systems. A bioethics is a new system which involves not only chemistry and biology, but also ecology. So it's where we define the system's boundaries, and that's the large part of system theory. You know, where do you define that boundary? And it's purely definitional. I think that if we go back to what we're talking about here today, in paper 120 in the manuals, not only mandates but recommendations of what Michael was to do before his bestowal. This idea of a system of positive religious ethics puts it up at a very high level, and gives him the ability to, gives Michael, when he finally does come down on the bestowal as a human, to be able to define what part of that system really should be delivered, so that it meets the goal of all peoples on the planet eventually. Back over to you.
I'd like to turn to Marvin now. Marvin, as most of you already know, lives in Nevada. He is not a resident of Las Vegas, but the city of Las Vegas is within a short drive of where he does live.
Nevada, Nevada, not Nevada.
Nevada. Okay, I guess it depends on how you pronounce certain vowels. But anyway, that doesn't detract from the effectiveness of the various systems in casinos in Las Vegas for separating tourists from their wallets, or from most of their contents of their wallets. There seem to be several parts to that system, and slot machines certainly are perhaps the most prominent in public knowledge, but there are also different kinds of gambling systems and so on. I would say that the system that the casinos have for this purpose are particularly effective, and they contribute to the economy of Nevada, or Nevada, depending on your pronunciation of certain vowels. But now, after all that long prologue, I would like to ask Marvin for his explanation of the system of ethics that is in question here in this paragraph, and whether it involves different parts that relate to each other.
I'll share a couple of comments, Neil. Just preliminarily, it's obvious that you are not a Nevada native, because any native of Nevada knows how to pronounce the word. You can define systems from multiple vantage point of multiple disciplines. Each has its own sense of systems and how they're used. Probably the one place where the Ranch book actually speaks of systems most cogently is in the paper in Personality Survival, where they speak of the personality of human being as a system. And this is one of my favorite quotes, so I could actually put my finger on it pretty readily. And it goes like this. It's from paper 112, section 1, paragraph 19. In aggregations, parts are added. In systems, parts are arranged. And the word arranged is actually in italics in the text for emphasis. In systems, parts are arranged. Systems are significant because of organization - positional values. In a good system, all factors are in cosmic position. In a bad system, something is either missing or displaced. So in a bad system, something that should be there isn't there, or it's in the wrong position in relation to the other elements of the system, or else it's something is inserted that shouldn't be there. A good example of a dysfunctional systemic arrangement long term is in the Christian, we're speaking of Christianity. The insertion of the atonement doctrine was not something that was part of the religious ethical system that Jesus taught. It was an insertion by Paul, relatively inadvertently, actually, from Jewish and other systems of thought into Jesus' systemic presentation. And it was dysfunctional, and it's remained dysfunctional according to the revelation. It shouldn't be there. And it's unfortunately been placed close up to the top of the systemic arrangement. So the question is, what better systemic arrangement of spiritual truth can we come up with from this revelation in order to communicate, in order to live out the spiritual teachings of the Ranch? We're going to communicate them effectively, culturally, is a question that I think is part of this inquiry, and one that I've been preoccupied with for a while. So yeah, the issue of systems. And then I just wanted to share one other passage that really relates quite cogently to the one that you've shared, Neil, because Gabriel enjoins Michael have we read the second paragraph yet? I'm sorry, Neil, maybe I'm jumping ahead. The paragraph number 5.
We read it, that is to say, Andre read it for us. We have not begun discussing it, but we will do that in the course of this webinar today.
I want to make a point related to it. When Gabriel says to Michael, in every possible manner, seek to avoid the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, or a segregated ethical group of mortal beings, he's enjoining Jesus not to create a social system, an organized religious institution in a sense. But I would share a thought that there's always, the Urantia book teaches dialectically, and there's very often situations where they make a thesis and then they'll balance it with antithesis, and sort of expecting us to develop a synthesis really of different points of view. And here's a passage that sort of balances the one that is in the one that you're citing. They say that Jesus foresaw that a social organization, a church, would follow the progress of the true spiritual kingdom. And that is why he never opposed the apostles practicing the rite of John's baptism. The church was an inevitable and useful social result of Jesus' life and teachings. The tragedy consisted in the fact that this social reaction to the teachings of the kingdom so fully displaced the spiritual concept of the real kingdom of Jesus as Jesus taught and lived it. So I think overall the stance of the revelation is that organized religious function, social religion, as a systemic endeavor, can be misconstrued and have things in the wrong position and be functional or dysfunctional, some combination. But that, as Jesus well understood, it was almost inevitable that something like that would evolve, even though he was enjoined from founding such an endeavor and did not do it. He full well understood that his evolutionary followers needed to engage in this and would engage in this kind of systemic endeavor. And the implication for me is there's a parallel to our situation with the Urantia book. The Urantia book as a revelation does not found a religion. They take pains not to instruct us in founding one. But I think the natural expectation is that if we're to be effective in our socialization of this religion as its evolutionary followers, we will likely need to develop these forms as well in ways that are creative and novel, and that speak to the needs of our day and generation with the essential spiritual teachings of the revelation.
Marvin, after the prelude, you have adopted a very effective system of miscellaneous observations, all of which were cogent, but I congratulate you on weaving them together so as to evade the specific question that I asked. Now, I would like to try that again with Stephen. What does it mean to say a system of positive religious ethics? Is this simply a collection of statements, or how does such a system of ethics work in your concept, Stephen? How do you think that Jesus applied this?
I think you just said that Marvin would make a really good politician.
I suppose if he masters the task of pronouncing the word Nevada, then he might be, yes.
Well,
A three concentric hat does it make God great again?
Okay, let's see. Yeah, thinking about Jesus' teachings, his ethical teachings, I think first and foremost about the parables, and which, as I said last week, the Hebrew word for parable is mashal, which is mystery or riddle. And, at first glance, it's very hard to integrate the idea of a system, an ethical system, with the teaching method of using parables. They seem to be diametrically opposed. I'm certainly no systems expert, but I think when they use the word system, they do use the adjectives enduring and improved. But I think in order to be enduring and improved, the ethical system has to be the opposite of rigid. The system has to be extraordinarily supple, and we use the word universal or universalistic. But in order to do that, it cannot be systematic, as we understand the word systematic, as Hegel might have used the word system in his philosophy. So it's really, in a sense, a counterfactual system that's able to adapt itself infinitely and equally effectively for different cultures, not only on this planet, but around the universe, around the local universe. So yeah, I think the word system is really of questionable value if we don't put a lot of attention into making sure our interpretation of that word is equal to what Jesus was able to teach with his teaching parables.
George, we have heard people talk about parables, I think with considerable merit. But the question that I really need to ask again is whether the ethics that Jesus put forward amounts to a system by integrating different components. And if so, what do you believe those components are?
Yeah, very interesting question. And I admit my thinking was similar to Marvin's. I also went to 112, paper 112, but I looked at a different piece of the description about systems. Specifically, let's see, it's section 1, paragraph 17. In that it says, quote, relationships exist between two objects, but three or more objects eventuate a system, and such a system is much more than just an enlarged or complex relationship. This distinction is vital, for in a cosmic system, the individual members are not connected with each other except in relation to the whole and through the individuality of the whole. So when I was thinking about trying to understand what these two sentences are really saying in terms of an ethical system, if we hypothesize that an ethical system is a cosmic system, which doesn't seem entirely unreasonable, then all ethical values in the system are connected with each other in relation to and through some other value. And of course, the first thing that pops into my head is the value of faith. I mean, we talk about faith as an insight, but we experience it as a value. And in religion, that is the central value. I mean, this is the way I'm thinking about it. And so I think it's reasonable to say he did present a system of religious ethics centered on faith, where all religious values are connected to all other religious values in and through faith. So that truth, beauty, goodness, love, holiness, the sacred, all of these values, they're all connected to each other in the system directly. And indirectly, you can talk about secondary relationships between any two values, like truth and beauty, or goodness and graciousness, and so on and so forth. Well, anyway, so I guess that's my answer to your question.
Well, thank you, George. I congratulate you on being the first person who really made a specific effort to talk about what the system is. And now I will turn over to Andre. Having read the passage, you turn out to be the cleanup hitter in regard to commenting on it. Andre, I put to you the idea that George just shared, that in effect, he commented that faith was the center of the system of ethics that Jesus put forward. Do you agree with that, or would you modify that somehow, or perhaps add additional elements?
I like the idea of centering it around faith. That's an interesting framework to put it in, because it relates then the philosophic level to the level of religion, in terms of thinking of under the rubric of the cosmic intuitions, for instance, where you would be thinking about, reason, logic, and faith. How that's relevant to me is the idea of, here's the injunction coming from Emmanuel to Michael, that he has, as a dispensational son, certain prerogatives. And mind you, what's interesting there is he's not saying, as a creator son, you have certain prerogatives. No, it's related to his function as a dispensational son. The planetary prince has the same kind of dispensational prerogatives. The Adamic son has the same kind of dispensational prerogatives to advance religious ethics. And that is, stated clearly in paper 52, Planetary Mortal Epics, where they say each dispensation, each mortal epic, receives an enlarged presentation of spiritual truth and religious ethics. The evolution of the religious capacity of receptivity in the inhabitants of a world largely determines their rate of spiritual advancement and the extent of religious revelation. So Michael had this prerogative by virtue of the fact he was coming as a dispensational son, partly for that express purpose. For his purpose, he was coming to achieve the experience of living the human life and to complete his 7 bestowals. But in that context, he was also coming as a dispensational son to advance religious ethics. Now, getting back to the point, how does faith come into that? It comes back to, what Marvin related back to in talking about systems. And while I appreciate what Stephen alluded to, that in the classic definition of what systems are, this doesn't relate. In the Urantian definition of systems, it relates quite well in the context of that quote out of paper 112, because in systems, parts are arranged. In a bad system, something is either missing or displaced, deranged. Well, what's been deranged in our system of religious ethics? The main thing that has been deranged in our system of religious ethics has been the whole concept of an angry God, a king judge whose character of king judgeness takes precedence over his fatherhood. Well, what Michael, as Jesus, sought to set aright was to give us the idea again that no. His father nature takes precedence. You don't run away from a good father. You run away from a bad father. You run even further away from a king judge, especially if you haven't done everything right. And who does everything right in the context of their life? Therefore, this advanced a system of positive religious ethics because, among other things, he put the father at the center of this. The other example of what he was doing is contained most eloquently in his statement to Nathaniel, after Nathaniel boneheadedly, talked about the golden rule in the way that he did. We'll all remember that. And where he goes into the 6 levels of moral meaning. Now, even though these are levels of morality and can be applied to just simple human relations, they can be applied to ethics as well. And that's just expanding relationships to relationships of relationships and beginning to muse through there. And that's what we're called to do here, is to advance our understanding by saying, the universe is entirely different when there's a good God at the center of all things.
Thank you. I appreciate your reference to a loving father instead of a king judge. I think that really is an extremely important part of the system of ethics that Jesus, the incarnated bestowal of Christ Michael, did establish. And I believe that this idea of a loving father probably does deserve to be set alongside the element of faith that George supplied. Although one could say that faith in a loving father effectively just expands the concept that George provided. Now, I understand that Marvin has received a text message from some casino whereby they provided additional ideas for him to express. And so I will now yield to Marvin once again.
Inspiration from a lower source, so to speak. Subconscious inspiration. Great conversation, and I felt some degree of guilt, Neil, in failing to respond to your question. And so I thought industriously, what is Neil asking? and of course, I think George's comments and Andre's and everyone's are very helpful. What I wanted to kind of build on those a little bit. When you talk about a systemic arrangement of ethical principles, I think you're talking about principles that relate fundamentally to our relationships, right? Because ethics is a matter of how individuals interact with other individuals in life as life unfolds. And the revelators say some interesting things about the systemic teachings of Jesus, how he taught systemically. And they organize some of those thoughts around the idea of symbolisms as systemic presentation. And this relates to the parables comment, I think, that Stephen was saying, because parables are symbolic communication in a storytelling mode. But Jesus attempted to move forward with a systemic, symbolic representation of the family as really describing the relationships between God and us, and between us and each other. After strenuous attempts to move forward with that systemic ethical presentation, he fell back to a second compromise level, the kingdom, and because of the circumstances among his followers who were looking for a Messiah, a kingly figure, and because there were largely kingdoms that were the prevalent form of government at that point in time. But he did say that the people of another future generation, which could arguably be us, would be ready to move forward with a higher symbolism, a symbol of a systemic ethical relationships, which was based on the family. And I think he stepped it up to a much higher level, because he said this systemic way of proceeding is not merely a matter of rituals and formulaic doctrines. He was saying it was the way you live. It was the actual living relationships that he was emphasizing needed to be transformed, starting with the transformative impetus of God's involvement in our deep intimate personal lives, changing us, transforming our sense of ethics in terms of who we are and our value in relation to our creator, making it come alive, and then flowing out from that impetus into our relationships with each other and transforming them to be familial, to be based in the caring and the love, the affection that sisters and brothers have for each other in a really ideal family. And that's the systemic ethical ideal that he put forward in myriads of ways throughout his teaching. He did it in endless variation with the parables and in many, many other examples. But that theme runs throughout his teaching and really runs throughout the revelation. So, yeah, just some of those thoughts.
Thank you. I would like to move on to a phrase that is somewhat later in the same paragraph we've been discussing.
I don't know if you saw that Bob raised his hand, by the way.
I did not. Bob, do you wish to jump in at this point?
Just real quick. Thanks, Marvin. I was going to let it go, but you know, an interesting thought I had about this, we've kind of gone sort of around the edges. That is, you know, what's the system of ethics, and has Jesus actually employed, or I should say, did he actually establish a system of positive religious ethics? And there was a definition of ethics that I wanted to put out here, and I wanted to say yes to that question that I just put out there. This is from the bioethicist Larry Churchill. He said, and this is his quote, I think I like this one the best of all: ethics is understood as the capacity to think critically about moral values and direct their actions in terms of such values for a generic human capacity to remain. And I think that that's, Steve mentioned that the system, and this is my paraphrasing of what you said, Steve, that a system should be useful to all. And, you know, going to the talk that we had last week about Jesus's bestowal, Michael's bestowal as Jesus was for the entire Nebuchadnezzar, for those here that are even in light and life, if they are to those to be, should be relevant to all. The system of ethics that he's employed have to involve morality, ethics, mores, and religion. Jesus saw religion as a cause, not as a result. But ethics has to be established, and I think the best system that I'm going to answer yes to that he did establish it was the 6 levels of the Golden Rule, and I won't talk about them in any detail, but they run from the level of the flesh to feelings to mind to brotherly love to the moral level itself, and then to the spiritual level. And he did talk about how that system could be established, and I think that that's if that particular teaching, the true teaching of Jesus, could be sent worldwide, that particular system is not partisan. Back over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate your helpful discussion of the ideas of the system involved. I would like to turn to the concluding words of that same sentence: positive religious ethics. And specifically, I would like to probe the word religious here. How are religious ethics distinct from ethics in general? What is the meaning of the word religious? Are we talking about religion in the very broad sense that the Melchizedek author of papers 99 through 103 uses? Or are we talking about some kind of organized association of an established religion? Do religious ethics pertain to the general concept of religion or to some framework of an organization? Andre, you have a chance at these ideas.
Well, I'll speak briefly to it. I think in the context of religious ethics, you know, we can certainly look at the broad picture, the field of all elements of what religion really is. However, the fact that this is being spoken of on Salvington between Emmanuel and Michael begs that it has to be about personal religion, and those and specifically then what comes to mind for me is how a personal religious relationship with God impacts one's ethics. It means that one's ethics are going to grow. And to me, that's the long and the short of how that is. I look forward to seeing how others expand on their view of religious ethics.
Thank you. I will now turn to Stephen, because the question of what religious ethics versus what are other kinds of ethics interests me. And I'm also still interested in the relationship of religious in very broad sense, as opposed to an organized religion. Stephen?
Well, yeah, I think we can get a hint about what that might mean in the next paragraph, where they're very clear about in every possible manner, seek to avoid the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, a segregated ethical grouping. Okay, so that is one way of looking at what they're talking about when they talk about religion. I think clearly in the context of paragraph number 4, when they say positive religion, positive religious, they're not referring to formal establishment, organized cult, crystallized religion. But they are talking about the kind of cult that's referred to repeatedly in paper 87. That's a flexible cult that's founded on a creative use of the imagination in terms of creating meaningful and living symbolic forms. And in that kind of environment, which can be called religious and should be called religious, you can have an improved and enduring system of positive religious ethics. So I think if you make that discrimination between crystallized religion and a living cult, then that helps to answer what they're talking about when they say religious in paragraph number 4.
Thank you, George. I would like to pursue this just to a slightly different level. Ethics, I think we will all agree, has a group relationship. One cannot have an ethics that pertains solely to what one does in one's own study or whatever. So ethics brings us in contact with other people by implication. And the issue then that I'd like to put to you has to do with where the ethics comes from. In effect, I believe that the interaction with the paragraph numbered 5 that Stephen explained does establish that we are talking about an internal ethical relationship of a religious character that comes from inside the human being, and perhaps in relation to that human being's faith in God, faith in the Father. Is this largely in keeping with your interpretation? Or are we talking about ethical matters with religious overtones that a human believer will act on in relation to other human beings?
Let me start like I like to start. Yes and no.
Well, good. You've learned a little bit from Marvin by going around the question. Go ahead, please.
As I was thinking about what you were saying, before you added all of the conditions and qualifiers to the question,
Yeah.
I do see a difference between religious and secular ethics. I mean, one recognizes God as the standard of ethics or moral values, and the other does not. So there's a difference. Your point about ethics being inherently social, I believe, is correct. How can you exhibit ethical behavior by yourself. You can exhibit moral behavior, but you have to interact with somebody in some way. So that um, led me to a quote from paper 101. You asked, what's the origin of ethics? And I think this provides at least a partial answer. Paper 101, the second paragraph in the paper. Religion is the ancestor of the advanced ethics and morals of progressive social evolution. Always is religion the inspiration of man's evolving nature, but it is not the secret of that evolution. And then they go on in the next paragraph to tell us what the secret is. It's the adjuster. There really is a true and genuine inner voice, that true light which lights every man who comes into the world. And this spirit leading is distinct from the ethical prompting of human conscience. So there really seems to be a clear connection here between the promptings of the spirit adjuster and the promptings of the ethical conscience. In other words, there can be an interaction. So that would explain how evolutionary religion is able to advance ethically, because along with the ethical conscience, there's this inner voice which acts, works in some way to elevate ethics by speaking directly. I don't know. I've never been able to decide if the adjuster, I suppose you can do it either way. You can either speak directly through the conscience or outside the conscious through some other way. The mechanism is not clear to me, but it's clear to me that, I think we can all detect this at some points. Occasionally we detect something happening that's out of the ordinary. And so, yes, I think that's the cause for the evolution of ethics, the adjuster specifically, the promptings of the adjuster. But the social evolution of ethics occurs within the context of religious, kind of double talking here. The social evolution of ethics, the evolution of ethics requires a religious activity of a social nature. So I don't know how well I answered your question.
I'm not sure I should give you a grade, George. You've said many things that are quite interesting. So if we talk about the net result, I think you succeeded in answering the question.
Okay.
Andre, I'd like to turn to the final sentence in the paragraph and ask
Neil, sorry, I did have some thoughts related to the religious ethics question. If we're going to return to it maybe later.
Okay, Marvin, go ahead.
The structure is interesting. You have an adjective in relation to a noun, religious ethics. I think there are other disciplines, fields that spawn ethical systems. Bob mentioned bioethics. Confucianism is a set of ethics that I would not call religious. It's sociological in a sense and based on philosophy, pure and simple. Marxism is a political set of ethics. And so when I ask myself the question, what characterizes religious ethics in particular, in contradistinction to some of these other ethical systems born out of other disciplines, I think religious ethics always has reference to a higher reality outside of human nature. Taoism stood on the shoulders of Confucianism, but had a sense of the way of heaven, of a higher way that is imported into human affairs. So that for me is it. Religious ethics have a sense of ethical relationship to a higher reality and even a higher person, out of which flow our sense of ethical obligations interpersonally.
Thank you. If I try my best to paraphrase what you've said, I think part of it is the idea that religious ethics involve a dimension upward, shall we say, into the spiritual realm, whereas other ethical systems can be essentially horizontal in connection with human beings and may not necessarily have a relationship to God or to the higher levels of spirit. Am I largely correct in that?
Yes, and in just in that context, the golden rule set of ethics is a universal ethic that actually I would not call religious per se, because it doesn't make necessarily reference to that vertical dimension. In fact, atheists and humanists have embraced the golden rule as their highest ideal, alongside an active belief that there is no higher reality, no higher being.
Okay, thank you. I would now like to do what I was trying to do
Yeah, sorry.
in terms of the next thought for discussion. The beginning of the final sentence in that paragraph states, as a dispensational son, you are granted certain privileges. I'd like to turn to Andre for his interpretation of the idea of privileges and dispensational son. Does this say something about the process of dispensations and the process of epical revelation?
It does. It's corroborated by what I spoke to earlier in paper 52, where again they make this this claim: each dispensation, each mortal epoch receives an enlarged presentation of spiritual truth and religious ethics. So that idea is that there is an idea of what can evolve naturally, what can evolve on its own, and we know that there's a certain amount of that is expected to occur even on normal worlds, because we can imagine that even dispensational sons are not interposing their hand and micromanaging every step of the way, that there are periods of revelation and allowing for that revelation to unfold. That definitely has been happening here. But what am I trying to say? They certainly are granting the prerogative to those that are directing a revelation at the beginning of a dispensation to at least interpose for that amount of time. But it's very interesting that they put it in the sense of granted certain privileges pertaining to the advancement of the spiritual and religious status of the world peoples when they make that claim. And in the context of the entire revelation, the value that is put on what can evolve on its own is why there is clearly restraint and why there is clearly no micromanagement, not to mention what we see as the aftermath of the Lucifer rebellion, where there was direct social engineering that was tried to be accomplished in an accelerated manner. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's where I go with it.
I think you have, but I'd like to push you just a slight bit that
Sure.
The growth that you described from paper 52, I think seems to be a fairly steady progression, but the context of this particular phrase of certain privileges seems to imply an acceleration, a sudden leap. Is that the way you look at it too?
Well, I would only look at it in context, and that is in the context of a world that is well off course. This should have been, for a bestowal son, another incremental increase from where we are. But given what we had lost as a result of the Lucifer rebellion and the failure of 2 dispensational revelations ahead of that, with only a third epical revelation shoring things up slightly, this was going to be quite a departure from where we had been. We really were functioning under some mixed version of primitive religion and authoritarian religion. And he was trying to bring us immediately to the idea that while there are some of you that are practicing personal religion, the vast majority of you are following these institutions and these outworn practices. I want to show you have a real relationship with God. And to that extent, that is an acceleration, but it's only an acceleration from a very retarded field.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think this might be a good time for me to comment on my role as the moderator. I regard all of you as my close colleagues, but I have to tell you, I have limits as the moderator. At one point, George asked me to comment on whether he had asked the question. And in Andre's earlier remarks, he asked, what am I thinking? Well, I can't tell what Andre was thinking. And I valued George's contribution. So please don't look at me as if I am suddenly the guru for this enterprise. I am pursuing this with you in a spirit of humility to the best degree that I can, while respecting all of your input. And I commend you for providing many insights into these complex matters. I am delighted to be able to participate with you on this level, but please don't infer that I automatically can tell you what you are thinking, as what Andre asked. All right, let's go down to the next paragraph, paragraph 5. And because we've been away from this for a certain amount of time, I wonder if I could ask Marvin just to read the paragraph for us once again, paragraph 5. You're muted, Marvin.
Sorry. This is a statement by Mantusha Melchizedek from 1329.
Page
120.
1329, paper
Yeah.
120. Yes.
Yeah, paper 120, section 3, paragraphs 4 to 6. I think this must be.
That would be paragraph 6 in that accounting, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm flipping around and I just lost the spot. I'll be right there. Page 12.
Paper 120, section 3, paragraph 6.
Yeah. As you may see fit, this is again Gabriel speaking to Jesus, to Michael.
Emmanuel speaking to Jesus.
Sorry.
Emmanuel speaking to Michael, sorry.
Thank you. As you may see fit, you are to identify yourself with existing religious and spiritual movements as they may be found on Urantia, but in every possible manner seek to avoid the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, or a segregated ethical grouping of mortal beings. Your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples.
Thank you. I would like to probe the intention here. Bob, what do you read the intention to be? The previous history of humanity had included many movements. There were many existing religions at the time. There have been many more that have developed since. Why is Emmanuel telling Michael not to create a religion, not to have a segregated group of followers?
Okay, just as we couldn't, you can't think what we're thinking of, I'm having a hard time trying to answer why why Emmanuel did that, but I will speculate or conjecture on that for sure. Okay, let me start with the first thought I had about taking a look at that, because I did highlight that part. Identify yourself with existing religious and spiritual movements. So I had to ask myself, well, what's a spiritual movement, or what's a movement? And did Jesus actually do that? Did he actually identify himself with some existing religious and spiritual movements? So a spiritual well, first of all, a movement is an organization that has an ideal, and it could actually be a cult-like ideal that is somewhat segregated and moves someplace. It's trying to be progressive versus static. So that's a general thought of what I thought about a movement. And of course, a spiritual movement is takes on transcendent thoughts. I'll get to the why in a second. So then I asked myself, did he actually identify with any existing religious and spiritual movements? So two came to mind. John the Baptist, obviously. Jesus was certainly identified, and John the Baptist was moving, meaning he was going beyond conventional norms. Everyone knows that. So that's one of the movements. And the other, maybe indirect, and this is somewhat speculative, is to take the ideas of the Symboitan philosophical schools, and was that a movement? I think it was, because he was trying to move into a pluralistic and diverse religious and theological approach, a philosophical approach to the world's religions at a time that was quite interesting. Probably hasn't been duplicated yet. I guess the World Parliament of Religions is kind of moving in that direction, or has been moving in that way. So did Jesus identify himself with those two? Yes, I think he did. So now to get to your question of why do I think Emmanuel did that? I think that, for going back to the question about this whole idea of positive religious ethics, and for this system to be a system that would be appropriate not only for Urantia, but for all of Nebadon, the 6 levels of the Golden Rule, go from the material down to the spiritual, or I should say from the material up to the spiritual. So I think a little differently about that, Marvin, in that I think that they can cut across all of those levels of morality, ethics, law, justice, mercy, and love. So I think that by Emmanuel imposing that, I'm sorry, he's not imposing it, as you may see fit. I think this is some of the areas that we talked about where Jesus, where the bestowal, certainly an emergency bestowal, has the opportunity to have these certain privileges. And to talk about one more privilege, I think the idea of when to perform a miracle, and the miracle of the blind beggar on the Sabbath, I think is clearly a privilege that would be allowed in an emergency time. And that's a really interesting event that I think has aided and abetted this idea of Jesus's development of positive religious ethics. And that he not only pushed out the positive side of it, but he also, in a very indirect way, tried to put some curtailment on the dogma, or on the static part of the idea of the Sabbath, for example, and not to do certain things. So hopefully that got to the answer of thinking a little bit about why a union of days would do that. Purely speculative on my part, though, Neil. Over to you.
Well, to reassure you and to reassure all our colleagues, we are discussing matters that are inherently speculative, and we are interpreting them to the best of our ability, but no one has all the answers, and we are in effect sharing different inspirations and ideas. Now, with that prelude, I would like to turn to Stephen in regard to what Bob identified as you may see fit, and then ask him to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of Jesus's upbringing in the Hebrew tradition as it existed. The revelators tell us elsewhere that the Hebrew religion had a very clear idea of a personal God. And in some other passage, which I would be not sure of being able to identify precisely, there is a statement that the location of Palestine was constructively useful as essentially the center of civilization, of having linkages east and west, toward the Orient and toward the western parts of the Mediterranean, and where it was advantageous. So anyway, what I'm trying to do here is to offer you the opportunity, Stephen, to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the existing religious movements in which Jesus was immersed as a Jewish boy growing up in his human form in a Hebrew cultural tradition and a religious system.
Okay. Well, I was going to start off by saying that maybe the word movements has thrown people off, but Jesus was a practicing Jew. From the day he was born to the day he died. And in that sense, he fully identified himself with the existing religion of Judaism. Now, he had criticism of some of its practices, as did many Jewish people. There were many Jewish people at the time who were very unhappy with temple practices and the way the temple was run. So Jesus was not unusual in that way. I think one reason that Michael chose to incarnate among the Jewish people was that they carried the knowledge of the Melchizedek revelation in a much more solid way than any other particular group of people. And it was easiest to kind of use that as a basis for further spiritual evolution, and not to mention the factors that you talked about, which were more political, social, and economical. So the main religious tradition that he identified himself with was the Jewish tradition, and that came in many forms. I mean, John the Baptist was a Jew. He was a reforming Jew, but he was a Jew. And you didn't stop being a Jew when you became a reformer. There was no such thing as heresy in temple Judaism. No matter what you believed, you were still a Jew. Now, if you did certain things that were beyond the pale, that's something else. If you married a Gentile, for instance, that was that was beyond the veil. But believing certain things and saying certain things, there was no basis for heresy like we're familiar with in the Christian religion. I'd also like to point out that that Jesus used his placement in the Jewish religion on certain occasions for teaching. So in paper 162, section 1, paragraph 9, it says, on several occasions, Jesus taught in Solomon's porch and elsewhere in the temple courts. These teachings were really the official or formal announcement of the divinity of Jesus to the Jewish people and to the whole world. And I would say to the whole universe. I will add that in on my own. So he was using the Jewish temple as what they call the official or formal announcement of his divinity in the temple. So I think that is an extremely important statement and event that I have never really heard discussed, and what that means for Jesus' desire to identify himself with an existing religious tradition. The only other thing I'd add at this point is that Emmanuel says this: as you may see fit, you identify yourself with existing religious spiritual movements. That's why we have the seraphim, who are the angels of the churches. Okay, there's a reason for that. Now, I know we have angels of progress, but we also have angels in the churches, and this reflects the importance of that role among the seraphim who serve this planet. As far as negatives, being involved with Jesus, being Jewish, well, you know, we're aware of the crystallization of the Jewish cult, the monopoly on the temple practices by the professional role of the Jewish priests. I mean, there were a lot of problems with the Jewish temple that, as I said before, many Jewish people were very aware of and very unhappy with. And that led to the proliferation of many Jewish groups at the time who were in rebellion, more or less, against the temple, John the Baptist being one of them. The Essenes, associated with Qumran, the Essene sect was another one. They were extremely unhappy with temple practice. So Jesus was not an outlier in that sense. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Would you say that in his overall teachings, he drew on perhaps a higher proportion of the heritage of Judaism than any other?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, it was more than a preponderance. It was virtually exclusive to the Jewish tradition. First of all, he was talking to Jewish people who had no familiarity with any other religious tradition to begin with. So if he did even try to, it would have been pointless to even do that. Now, of course, Hellenism, Greek philosophy and thinking, had been in Palestine for hundreds of years. So Jesus was able to utilize, you know, certain Hellenistic rhetorical practices and certain Hellenistic ideas within the context of Judaism. But that was not unusual at that time. Rabbis did that all the time. I mean, Greek was the lingua franca of Palestine and Judea at that time. Greek was very commonly understood by educated people. So it's not to say it was exclusively Judaic Palestinian ideas, but all the ideas were broached in the context of Jewish belief and understanding.
Thank you, Stephen. I would now like to probe concerning Jesus's methods when he went to Rome and talked with the proponents and advocates of various religious movements and religions that were present there. George, does his willingness to talk over religious matters or spiritual matters, if you prefer, with the advocates of various religious movements in Rome amount to part of his ability to draw on these instructions from Emmanuel as you may see fit? Do you see a relationship there?
Well, certainly he was preparing the way for what would happen during the public phase or following the public phase of his teaching. But at that time, he was a private individual. And, you know, when he was during that same trip, he gave a discourse on time and space. After that trip, before his public work, he gave the Urmia lectures. So he had a very wide set of interests, and he discussed them with people. He discussed politics. He had opinions, which I believe he expressed in private, but everything changed when he started his public work. So in terms of his interactions with religious leaders in Rome of the various religious sects. You know, he as they describe it, he never contradicted them. He would land on one positive element in their teachings and exemplify or amplify it and exalt it to the point where it started to crowd out the incorrect ideas. You know, and I've often thought, I wonder if anyone could think of a way to do that with Christianity, to get rid of the atonement doctrine, you know, without actually attacking it. Find a way, find something else in Christianity to elevate to the point where it just forces it out. Well, that was a tangent.
George, that's a wonderful question. I don't think that any of us has an answer. I believe that if this is going to happen, it would have to be by some kind of impetus from inside the various denominations. It's difficult to foresee that because the atonement doctrine is so deeply entrenched. But this is a question that deserves to be considered. Stephen, I think you're going to consider it for us.
Very, very briefly, what we call the atonement doctrine is only one version of the understanding of Jesus' death and crucifixion in Christianity. We are talking about basically what we are familiar with, which is the evangelical Protestant version that started with Luther and Calvin and the Reformers. That's what we call the atonement doctrine. What came before that, there were many different versions that came before that and were more native to Christianity than what we call the atonement doctrine. So I'll leave it at that, but we're under a misunderstanding to think that there's only one atonement doctrine, and the one that we're familiar with has historically been the dominant one. That's just not the case.
Thank you. I think this would lead us to a very long discussion if we were going to pursue it in detail, but I respect your insight and your opinions. Those are ideas that deserve to be considered at some appropriate moment. I think, frankly, from the perspective of the moderator, this is not the moment in which I wish to undertake that discussion. I would like to pursue the implications of the second half of the paragraph about seeking to avoid in connection with a paragraph from Jesus's first discourse on religion just a few pages earlier in the same paper. Specifically, I will now proceed to read paragraph 12 in section 5 of the same paper, 155, in which, in effect, Jesus disconnects himself from the Hebrew organized tradition, and it reads as follows. This again is paragraph 12 in section 5 of paper 155. It reads as follows. And Jesus went on to say, quote, at Jerusalem, the religious leaders have formulated the various doctrines of their traditional teachers and the prophets of other days into an established system of intellectual beliefs, a religion of authority. The appeal of all such religions is largely to the mind. And now we are about to enter upon a deadly conflict with such a religion, since we will so shortly begin the bold proclamation of a new religion, a religion which is not a religion in the present day meaning of that word, a religion that makes its chief appeal to the divine spirit of my Father, which resides in the mind of man, a religion which shall derive its authority from the fruits of its acceptance that will so certainly appear in the personal experience of all who really and truly become believers in the truths of this higher spiritual communion. Well, gentlemen, I would offer you at least the tentative opinion that this paragraph in the earlier section of the same paper does amount to a strenuous effort on Jesus's part to avoid the establishment of a segregated ethical grouping, to avoid the establishment of a formal religion. Marvin, I see you rubbing your head. Was that a motion for the floor, or was that just because you had an impulse to rub your head?
had more to do with the condition of my scalp, but if you're offering the opportunity, I'll take it.
Go ahead.
Uh, I'm going to try and speak to your most recent question, but also have reference to the three separate thoughts or sentences in the paragraph 5 that we've been discussing, and that fifth paragraph is really interesting. Emmanuel actually says three different things, makes three separate statements. One, he said, is feel free, if you'd like, to identify with a particular movement or religion of your time, which I agree entirely with Steve. He identified as a Jew, taught as a Jew to the Jewish people. So that's fairly straightforward in my thinking. There are lots of different ways to interpret it, but it seems sort of apparent to me. The second statement, he says, avoid, and the precise wording I think is important, the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, these are strong adjectives, a segregated, meaning set apart, ethical group of mortal beings. And the question you've presented us at the earlier point, Neil, is how did Jesus act to do that, and why? Why did Emmanuel present him that injunction? And notice the first statement Emmanuel makes is a choice for Jesus. He says, "You may if you wish." The second one is an injunction. He says, "You must not do this." And if you ask why, I think the answer to why resides in the third statement, which Emmanuel makes, which is, your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples. So he tells him something, here's something you may do. Then he says, here's something you must not do. And here's the goal that you should actually try to accomplish, which is structure your teachings, which could be a religious ethical system of principles, in such a way that it would be accessible and absorbable by all existing religious traditions, universal in its appeal. And that's what Jesus set about to do. Now, interestingly enough, from that passage that I shared earlier, again, dialectically, Jesus understood that his followers would form an organized religious effort of some sort. He hoped that he did everything he could to so teach them that they would be prevented from organizing it in such a way, establishing in such a way that it was A, crystallized, or B, segregated from other groups of spiritual seekers. He did his best to equip them in their socialization of their religion to do it, as Steve mentioned, flexibly, creatively, ever adaptively, and in a way that could spread and be absorbed and incorporated into all of the teachings of all of the existing religious traditions. They failed signally to do that. They did exactly what Jesus was enjoined against, and Jesus didn't do it. They did. So Christianity is now one of that number of segregated and crystallized and often rigid systems of religious thought, with, as Steve has often reminded us helpfully, many variations that are creative and growing edge. That's going on as well. And Christianity itself is a vast, multifaceted set of institutions that then has many fronts that are growing, evolving fronts. But the challenge that Emmanuel placed before Jesus in that last sentence, which was to share his teachings in such a manner as to be assimilable by all religious groups, and in a manner that was consistent with his Urmia teachings, that is friendly to and supportive of and appreciative of the variety and richness of religious traditions. But to do so in a way that's even-handed and portrays a vision that is transcendent or universal, over and above these historical expressions. That challenge remains for us. And I think the Urantia book and in the person of Jesus says it to us again in our day and generation. It remains for us to take Jesus' life and teachings and present them in a way that does not fall into the trap of segregated, crystallized, organizational, highly institutionalized function. It's a big challenge, but I don't think the challenge is simply to live our personal religion. I think it's more than that. I think it's to do that, and then, in addition, to reach out and organize and socialize efforts that avoid the pitfalls and maximize the benefits of our group religious function. And we're going to have that challenge evolutionarily for hundreds of years to come with this revelation.
Thank you, George. I'd like to focus on the middle element, the second element that Marvin identified, but in effect, the second element of the thought, avoiding the formal establishment of an organized cult, crystallized religion, a segregated ethical grouping. And I'd like to ask you about how this relates to the principle of spiritual freedom that Jesus enunciated in the paragraph from the preceding section of the same paper, the one that I read, about the inner relationship with God. Is avoiding an organized cult, crystallized religion essential if one is going to preserve the idea of a personal relationship with God without following someone else's orders or pattern?
Yeah, the injunction against, yes, it does relate directly to intellectual emancipation. In personal religion, there is no personal religion without faith, as we understand it from reading the Urantia book. So faith is primary. And what faith does for the intellect is it frees it of all of these erroneous beliefs which evolutionary religions have perpetuated. And, you know, over the course of these webinars, we've covered a number of these erroneous beliefs. But the only way to get rid of a belief, well, how do you get rid of a belief? If you believe something, you need to be, in order for you to stop believing in it, you have to be convinced it's wrong. Well, how can you become convinced that something you've believed in for a long time, you've believed it's true, you come to decide, well, it's not true. You know, Jesus addresses this directly. It's faith which does this. Faith liberates the intellect from false beliefs, because if you accept the insight of faith, then all of these erroneous ideas about a wrathful, vengeful, remote, impersonal God, all of those ideas go away, and you're left with a clear, it just clears the intellect. It clears the intellect of all of these false ideas. So that's the first step. And you can't all of the, I don't want to say all of the, but many of the faiths and evolutionary religions impede the reception of the insight of faith, because belief binds thought in a way that doesn't permit it to be creative. We can sort of see this in the secular realm with the phenomenon of political correctness. It's very direct. There's no beating around the bush. People are simply told it's not right to think these thoughts or say these things. So it's a form of bondage, intellectual bondage. And so the thing that frees you from that is faith. So faith liberates the intellect, which opens the door to real, genuine personal experience, religious experience.
Thank you,
Over to you.
George. I appreciate your references to faith and individual experience. Indeed, that is an important part of the essence of what Jesus was advocating in the paragraph that I read earlier. Uh, Andre, I'd like to turn to you in regard to the same portion of the first sentence of that paragraph in terms of the relationship to authority and people in charge who enforce uniformity and conformity. Doesn't this injunction by Emmanuel avoiding the formal establishment, et cetera, amount to stating that individual leaders or heads of an organization should not be entitled to dictate to individuals what they believe?
Wow, that's a very interesting pronouncement. And were I to just answer it summarily and with a broad brush, I would say, well, of course. But I was given pause by the fact that we have many papers in the Urantia book which illuminate the evolution of religion on our planet. And in the course of the evolution of religion, one of the main vehicles by which religious thought and development occurred was by there being individuals at various stages that kept the group in line. We see that early on, fear was even a powerful impetus. So, what is this statement to Michael regarding versus what are the implications for individual leaders? And I'd say that provisionally, I think you're right that this implies that we don't want individuals to be dictating, if we want to, use the clear black and white terms, to others what they ought to be believing, what their relationship with God ought to be. On the other hand, this has been a great part of our evolution, and this is the large departure. I mean, the statements that were made earlier about universalizing the appeal to various individuals by dint of not organizing a cult, not formulating a crystallized religion, and not creating a segregated ethical grouping of mortal beings. This, I would agree with you, was tantamount to Emmanuel saying, don't add to the problem. On the other hand, it's not a, I can't see the celestial hierarchy judging evolution. What I can see is them saying, listen, this is the next step in evolution, is moving people more to a viewpoint that they have a personal relationship with God. This would have obtained much more naturally had the normal order obtained on Urantia. Now it's more of a departure, as has been said a few times here today. It's more of a radical adjustment. But it really is just bringing people to something that is not a natural understanding for themselves. Therefore, you're not doing this is not a judgment on others having done this, but we'd like to move them away from that so that each individual, there's almost a desire to democratize democratize religion in the sense of even its organized sense, that if I and you have an individual relationship with God, and we discuss that with each other, we might develop mutual respect for each other's viewpoints and learn from each other in that regard, much in the same way as that we all learn from each other in this forum. This is not, an authoritative forum where one authority is battling it out with another. This is a dialogue among 6 individuals who mutually respect each other and have had very different, religious experiences, and yet understand that that's the kernel of religious and spiritual development. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. I agree with you that here we are, 6 of us, and we do respect each other. I do have some concerns about the text messages from casinos that appear to be landing on Marvin's desk, but that's not his fault if he happens to be the recipient. Now, Bob, let me give a slight variation on themes that some of your colleagues have been talking about, the question of personal relationship with God and personal observance and belief, as opposed to group manifestation. And indeed, now we get to the question of a leader and the possibility of constructive leadership, helping others voluntarily, as opposed to enforcing uniformity by some process of discipline. So how would you put those elements together in the context of this sentence, perhaps give us some kind of a prescription?
Unity of spiritual experience, not uniformity of belief. So I'll start with that. I think there's a pretty interesting set of statements in paper 87 about the cult, and being that that's one of the things that, or I should say, one of that trio of functions that Jesus was to avoid. There was a statement by the Brilliant Evening Star, and he says that every inspiring ideal grasp for some perpetuating symbolism, and that symbolism seeks some technique for cultural manifestation which will ensure survival and augment realization, and the cult achieves this end by fostering gratifying emotion. So I have to translate that, and I translate that to say that a cult is a distinct social organization that attempts to perpetuate an inspiring ideal by the technique of fostering emotional symbolism. The culture of the cult is to ensure survival and augment the realization of some idealistic vision through goals. So I think I have to approach the question or the premise in the question with to say that there's 2 different kinds of cults, progressive and retrogressive cults. I don't think they're static cults. They either stay or they don't stay. But the progressive cult has to facilitate spiritual progress and enhance cosmic meanings and augment moral values and encourage social development for a high acme of personal religious living. And I think George brought it up well when he said that, faith liberates the intellect. That's what a progressive symbolism has to liberate the individual from that. I may be avoiding the question. Pose the question again, and I'll wrap this up.
I asked you in part to associate the principle of leadership on the one hand as compared with the principle of enforcing conformity or uniformity, and in addition, as a contrast to the idea of group control of the individual.
Yeah, that's kind of why I went to the idea of the cult. The progressive cult has leaders and not managers. It's pretty much the way I see this. A manager is going to enforce rules and make sure that the operation exists the way it is and keeps the operation and never progresses. But the positive religious ethical system is the one that ought to be instantiated with this symbolism that allows for pluralism and diversity, which is what we're trying to express here ourselves. So those two are really juxtaposed. One is progressing and one is retrogressing, is about the way I see it. But these symbols, and the Revelators, the Brilliant Evening Star tells us that there's nothing wrong with a cult, but that cult can't be segregated. I thought of the Gnostics maybe as being a segregated cult, and none of their pluralistic and diverse and frankly, rich thinking was not available to future generations until we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think, I could be a little bit wrong about, when those actually came out. So it goes back to this whole dynamic aspect of religion. And just to sum up the system, go back to the idea of the system. I see it as, I see a system as inputs and outputs, and it can be homeostatic, but the cult has to be able to, or the symbolism that is that can handle this dynamic. I mean, think of the planet. The life carriers have established the most efficient organic system that could possibly be done. How does the salinity of the ocean stay at 3.4%? No one knows how yet. How does the oxygen stay at 22%? It shouldn't. There's some sink and some input that basically allows those two things to happen. And as the planet gets it pulls in different energies. There's solar spots. There's more humans. The planet adjusts itself. Maybe why, like the grand universe is an organism alive. Maybe that's why the planets may fit that same definition. So this leadership has to allow for that, and needs to be faith-driven. I think also, as George has said earlier. I just follow up with that. Back over to you.
Thank you. I would now like to go to the final sentence in this paragraph, namely, your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples. Marvin has requested an opportunity for additional remarks, and I would ask him to supplement whatever additional ideas he may have had in the first place with an evaluation of the timeline of that final sentence. Your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples. Are to become is a vague way of stating a future. And I would like him to comment on the implications of the timeline, in addition to his own thought that he wished to express.
Thank you, Neil. Interestingly, the conversation, I believe the conversation we've been having about leadership and authority and structure and cult and culture, as Bob brought them in, is very relevant to the question you've just asked, which is the goal of sharing the essence of what Jesus taught and lived with all our existing cultures, all our existing religious traditions, which remains a goal out ahead to be achieved. It's not yet achieved. And I wanted to make a comment about our culture, our meaning the culture of the Urantia movement in particular. And do a little compare and contrast. In the I think the late 1800s, 1850s, 1800s, a new religion was founded. And I choose it because it's an example. Well, okay, let me back up and say, I think this phenomenon of leadership and it's called high church, low church, and also church or religious polity, the degree to which a religious organization is top down or horizontal. This is a well-studied phenomenon. And if you take a look at the Mormon church and how it's developed, and it's probably about 60, 70 years earlier in its founding than our movement. So we're roughly contemporaneous. right? They had a little more of a head start, but we've been around 100 years. They've been around 160, 70, 80 years, something like that.
Marvin, I hate to interrupt you, but I would like you to clarify what you've just said. I don't think you're implying that the movement of readers of the Urantia book is a church in the way that the Mormon church is a church.
Exactly. I'm trying to draw a contrast.
Okay.
So on the bell-shaped curve of polity, the Mormon church would be over it against one end. They're highly organized. They have a highly top-down structure, right, with authoritative leadership that dictates precepts and then gets followed. And in the last 170, 80 years, they have grown phenomenally quickly, and they've accomplished their mission rapidly and with great effect comparatively as a quite a young religion. And I don't think it's coincidental that their rapidity of spread has some relationship to their structure as a culture, as a cult. And if I look at our movement, I see us at the very other, much at the other end of the bell-shaped curve. I think we're almost allergic in culturally, have an allergic reaction to the idea of cultural formation and strong leadership even. You know, and we're a highly individualistic culture. And I don't think we are in danger of becoming too overly organized and crystallized. I think our risk is at the other end. I think our risk is that we will not be able to become sufficiently organized and not properly understand the valuable role of leadership, spiritual leadership and organizational leadership in order to accomplish the mission that the revelators have given us, the multiple missions. I think our error is that we may be too individualistic actually as a culture. That's the risks I think we confront. And so in order to accomplish the imperative in that third statement that Emmanuel makes, which is to spread this way of life that Jesus shared with us and is reshared with us in this revelation to all cultures, we're going to have to do what Ahsoka did with his training and what Melchizedek did with his training, what Jesus did with his training. We're going to have to get organized and concerted and develop leadership structures to train people to accomplish a mission. And we have allergic reactions as a culture to those kinds of endeavors. It's compared to many other religious cultures. And I think it's a real challenge for us. And this conversation is representative of some of these issues in the way we're talking about it and our different discussions. So it's a very live unfolding phenomenon, and that last statement in the paragraph remains up for grabs, whether we will be able to organize effectively to accomplish what Jesus enjoined us to accomplish, what his followers did to some extent, but failed in other respects because of over crystallization, etc. Will we do any better in the next 1,000 years? Remains to be seen.
I would point out that your most recent sentences about whether we will be able to organize and accomplish it amount to an interpretation of the question as if it were a matter of activity and particularly focused effort on the part of a group of readers of the Urantia book. I think that the sentence that we're talking about, your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples, is not only vague in regard to the timeline, but it's also vague in regard to the mechanism.
I agree.
And so now I would like to turn to George with essentially the same question that I asked you. What kind of a timeline do you put on that final sentence, George? Your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples.
500 years.
500 years. Okay.
Because
A
this
decisive
revelation
answer.
is
You have not
supposedly only
avoided the
gonna
question.
last for 1,000. This revelation supposedly is intended for 1,000 years. So I figure about halfway through, we should be ready to start taking it seriously.
Thank you, Stephen. What do you say about George's estimate of 500 years?
Well, before I give you my magic number, I'd just like to register a disagreement with George, actually. I don't believe that faith is necessarily intellectually corrective. I think these are two separate realms that have an influence on one another. But for instance, let's just give an example of St. Francis. Let's just assume for argument's sake that St. Francis was a man of faith and a man of pure faith. Nevertheless, he had ideas, religious ideas, theological ideas that we would consider incorrect. Now, did he have faith? Yes. Did he have incorrect intellectual ideas? Yes. So I don't agree that faith is an intellectual conditioner in that way. I think it's more complicated than that. Anyway, a number, gee, numbers are cheap, you know. I will say, now the number you're asking for is when the teachings of Jesus will become dominant on the planet. What exactly are you?
I'm asking you
for?
to interpret the final sentence. Your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples.
Okay. Well, that could be in differing degrees in differing areas. Common heritage is kind of a vague term. I would say for the ideas of Jesus to spread around the world has already happened. I think to a certain extent, they already are the common heritage. Will they be increasing over time? Yes. Can I give you a strict and clear number as to when this will be accomplished? No, because I don't think there is any such number because it's a vague concept.
Thank you, Andre. Your turn.
No mathematician worth their salt would not take umbrage with the statement that numbers are cheap. My goodness gracious.
Certainly no proprietor of a casino would agree with that either.
Oh, that's a good point. You know, I might have flippantly said 1,000 years, you know, but you're really begging some reflection on this. One of the things that I would reflect on is that this statement was made 2,000 years ago by Emmanuel, and it hasn't occurred yet. So in that context, I would even be willing to extend this several thousand years. And my reason for doing that is the qualification, all religions, all peoples. That's really quite a statement for this, and quite a goal, actually, for life and teachings to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples. This is going to take perhaps not just this epical revelation, which is clearly a desire to steer a slightly new course than has been going before, since the life and teachings were largely lost in Christianity. They're there, but they're there in much muted and much attenuated form. And so here we are with a revelation that is designed to illuminate and resurrect, if I may, some of Jesus' life and teachings as it currently exists in Christianity. I would say that this is thousands of years out. What might occur over the next 500 to 1,000 years? And I'm not disagreeing with George at all in terms of saying 500. I don't think he pulled that out of his hat. He's a physicist, for God's sake. He thought about this. He quantified it. You know, what the plus or minus on that is, I don't know. I know you quantified that too. But what I would say with regard to that is, I would say 500 years is a really good place, a really good marker to perhaps judge a tipping point, a significant tipping point, where we might see a majority of peoples having acquired these life and teachings. And from there, it's a matter of incremental evolutionary development for greater and greater numbers of peoples. But when substantially might the mass of humanity have turned the corner on this? I would agree with George, possibly 500 years on that, but thousands of years before this is brought to full fruition. And that may mark the beginning of the next, if not epical revelation, dispensational revelation.
Thank you. I think the various dimensions that you have pursued in relation to these circumstances are very useful. The phrase, the common heritage, is inherently ambiguous. It seems to me that if we're talking about the common heritage of all religions, the implication is that there are religions, that they continue to exist in some manner. The idea of common heritage does not mean that these ideas have displaced every other element in these various religions. So I wonder if Marvin might have concluding remarks before he heads for the exit. He has stated to me that he is on the slope. I would not call it a slippery slope, but at least a slope leading out the door.
I'm very glad that you unpacked the meaning in that phrase, implied in that phrase of common heritage. I'm quite engaged, as some of others of you may be, in the interfaith world. I work with a nonprofit locally, an interfaith council, and there's a phenomenon at the Parliament of World Religions where some 8,000 to 10,000 people gather for a week from all different religious traditions. There's a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that there's an overarching sense of relationship as sincere religionists that transcends our particular religious traditions that we come with. And that's not to shortchange the value of our different traditions. There's an appreciation of the richness and the variety, but there is a sense of overarching transcendent relationship that emerges at these gatherings that is, to me, a foretaste of a future culture, hopefully a global culture, where Jesus' teachings of our kinship, transcending our different institutional loyalties of every kind, can emerge as a prominent cultural feature for us. So I'm hopeful, and I agree with you. I don't think it needs to displace our particular traditions. I think it can, in a sense, transcend and unify. They say that the religion of Jesus and the brotherhood of the quote, the kingdom, as he described it, must eventually be what they called a living organism, as in contrast to institutions. And they said that institutions can support that living organism, but must not supplant the living relationship. So I think what you're saying is prescient, Neil.
Thank you, Marvin. I now issue a formal exit visa. You may go out the door if that is your inclination. We will say goodbye to you on the understanding that, excuse me, you are on the list for our next webinar, which actually will occur 2 weeks from today, namely on the 2nd of May.
Thank you, Neil.
You're welcome. Bob, I would now like to pursue with you an element of common heritage, and the implication that I was trying to draw forth before is to assume that common heritage does not mean the sole concept, but part of the concepts that the various religions existing at some moment that Emmanuel has foreseen, as Andre has said, foresaw well in advance, since 2,000 years have elapsed and this is nowhere near happening. But what would your theory be in terms of common heritage? Is this, shall we say, the essential point, or simply an auxiliary element on the side of some other element that may be in these various religions?
I'm glad you asked me that because I was thinking about that. So I don't know if that's a kindred thought or whatever, but every time I reread an area in the text, I learn to adapt new psychological, social, and spiritual realities as a result of it. And frankly, listening to the discussion and reading the sentences, everybody was posing, a number on it. I'm thinking a little bit differently about this now, so I'll provide that. So common heritage. I got thinking about what is that? And there, that wonderful story about, a mother, a grandmother, and a child, and females, of course. And the child says, "Mom, why do you cut off the ends of the, the ham before you put it in the pan?" She says, "I don't know. You got to go ask Grandma." So she asks Grandma, and she says, "I don't know. You got to ask Great Grandma." So she goes over and she asks Great Grandma, and she said, "Oh, because the pans weren't big enough when we first did that, so we had to cut the ends off it." And I kind of, unless you dig back to the origin, that family had a common heritage of everybody cut off the ends of the ham to put it in the pan, no matter what size the pan was. I'm sure they're bigger nowadays. They didn't have to do that. All right, so that's my metaphor for what I kind of thought what a common heritage would be. And that took me then to the next thinking, which is billions of years. I don't think that paragraph, that sentence, well, there's two ways to think of the sentence. You could think of it that Emmanuel is saying, you're going to have to do it so that your life and your teachings become part of a common heritage of all your ranching. But his bestowal was for all of Nebadon from now and into the future. So if we take it that way, and we take it that Emmanuel is saying that's how it's going to happen, then we're already 200 billion years old in the local universe. What's a couple billion or two? So, I know everybody answered it, and I started out this way thinking, everybody, that we're talking about Urantia here. 500 years is a great number, plus or minus 300 or so. But I'm not certain that's the way that sentence goes now. And I'm throwing it out and tossing it that because we talked about this at length last webinar, is that Michael's bestowal as Jesus, as the human, the 1 in 10 million planets, is for all of the whole local universe. That common heritage will be stories. The neighboring planet is probably getting stories coming to them somehow. I don't know, maybe a magisterial son shows up and says, "Let me tell you about the story of Jesus and Urantia." Well, they don't have any video. Maybe they don't have video. I don't know. I'm kind of guessing that also. But as these stories become legend, there'll be a common heritage of all of the future religions that may appear on the rest of the, what do we got left? I forget what we got left. 3 to 10. The other 7 million planets that are to be inhabited, I suppose. That's my thoughts, at least at this point. And I have to thank the group for, it's great to go last. You have an opportunity to think through some of these things a little differently. So, it's certainly a speculation here, but that's kind of where my thoughts went for this one. Over.
Thank you. I'd like to speculate a little bit on some of your remarks because I think we run the risk of assuming that the circumstances on other planets are similar to ours. And I think that's a very shaky assumption. The planets that are not in a situation of rebellion have a very different relationship to the spiritual leadership of our local universe. And I would imagine, a speculation of my own, that the circulation of information on spiritual matters is quite different. And they are not on these other planets in systems that have never rebelled, subject to the same restrictions about these spiritual circuits that do apply to us. And so what kinds of revelation they receive concerning the bestowal of Michael on Urantia in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth is a question that I could not answer. I simply have no way of knowing about that. But I do believe that you are correct from my personal perspective that common heritage does indeed apply to elements of their reality on the other inhabited planets in Abaddon. That is indeed, in my opinion, a corollary of the principle that Jesus, the human bestowal of Christ Michael, lived his life for the entire local universe. Andre, I'm going to turn back to you and wonder whether you would be able to eliminate this idea of common heritage as opposed to other traditions or other elements in the religions that may still exist at the time that Jesus's teachings in life are a common heritage.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I understand what nuance you're getting at here.
I'm saying that Jesus's life and teachings are not going to be, in this sentence at least,
Yeah.
the exclusive religion, but an element of all religions. And so I'm asking you to perhaps give an idea of how the relationship between other elements and his teachings might exist in these contexts.
Well, as religion evolves on this planet, and keeping it, confined to the planet for right now, but at the same time honoring Bob with my vote for the out of the box thinking award for this meeting. I would agree that just becoming an element, not having to absolutely dominate other religions. Well, when was Michael's thinking as Jesus on this planet such that he tried to dominate anybody's thinking? Never. He was always presenting it for the free will to be in operation for everybody. So I would agree with you that it may, to a greater or lesser extent, become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples, and at the same time be assimilated to a greater or lesser extent. But at least the implication of this statement is that it should be assimilable. In other words, Emmanuel was exhorting him to make sure that whatever you teach, it's assimilable by all people. It's something that people don't have to reject out of hand because it's that far. Not that Jesus would have ever done that. To me, some of Emmanuel's exhortation is one of those sort of, I'm exhorting you, but I'm publicly displaying this for all to see so that they may learn from what is being said, even as we are learning from what is being displayed to us about what Emmanuel is saying to Michael before he becomes Jesus. But I would agree with you that, what I see in this is that is a first step in all religions moving toward becoming that state of affairs on a world in light and life where there is one language first, one philosophy, and one religion. How does that happen? It can only happen for there to be, first of all, religious unity, and therefore then the desire for people to look at their philosophies and say, hey, I let's assimilate, let's make a better philosophy out of all our philosophies.
Thank you. I think we've come just about to the end of the time available, but I will offer to George and to Stephen the opportunity to jump in again for final remarks if either of them wishes to do that. Okay, George, you're up.
Yeah, no, what you were saying, Andre, made me think of what Stephen brought up a while ago about Jesus declaring his divinity in the temple. And that was his divinity for the whole of Nebadon, to tie in with what Bob was saying. So, I mean, right there, you could say on that level, if you're looking at all of Nebadon, that's part of the common heritage that is being addressed here. The idea just struck me. I'll just throw it out there.
Thank you. Stephen, do you have any concluding remarks you'd like to share with us?
No, I'm done. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. As I mentioned before, we will be on the air again 2 weeks from today, and we will start with formal question H that appears just underneath the passages that we have been discussing. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Good to be with
Bye.
you all.